November 22nd, 1945. The Rhineland breathed damp earth and coal smoke, a bitter scent clinging to broken streets and half-buried cellars, as if the ruins themselves exhaled. In the shadow of collapsed walls, German women sat wrapped in patched coats, faces hollowed by hunger, hands clenched as though warmth could be forced back into their bones by will alone. They were in American custody, marked as prisoners, and yet this confinement felt quieter than the chain marches that had driven men across half a continent. Not triumph, not ceremony, only the stillness of people who no longer knew what category they belonged to. They were not honored civilians, nor soldiers, but fragments of a fallen state, waiting for a verdict that had not yet been spoken aloud. On that day, something unexpected broke the routine. American officers ordered a Thanksgiving dinner, an old ritual ferried across the ocean into a land still smoldering with grief. For weeks, ships had brought frozen birds, sacks of potatoes, crates of flour, tins of cranberries, the ingredients of a holiday far from the farms of Iowa, Georgia, and Michigan, where boys once ate at their mothers' tables. The meal was meant for soldiers who missed home. Then came a decision that startled even those giving the orders. An invitation extended past the wire to the women deemed enemies by years of slogans and threats. They entered the mess hall with wary steps, boots scraping old wood, breaths held against the warmth of aromas that felt like danger. Roasted meat, gravy thick with fat, bread pulled from field ovens while the light still held. They glanced at each other, eyes darting, whispers in guarded German slipping between clenched teeth, unsure if this was kindness or a stage for humiliation. The room itself was simple, planks hammered into long tables, dented tin plates stacked neatly, candles stubbed into bottles to push back an early dusk that settled over everything. For those who had eaten watery cabbage soup and loaves stretched with sawdust, the sight of plenty felt unreal, like stumbling into a photograph from another life. Pots clanged, English jokes rose and fell, and along the center line of the hall stood ranks of steaming turkeys, skin shining with butter that caught. Shrugged and said the holiday was larger than grudges, and an empty stomach harms no one by being filled. The war had ended in May, but suspicion survived like a thorn under skin. Behind simple gestures stood the absence of comrades lost on beaches and in forests. For a moment, the hall held its breath. Forks hovered. Conversation fell quiet. Hunger pressed like a hand on the back of the neck, and mistrust braced against it. A gray-streaked woman with a proud spine raised her fork first, placed a morsel on her tongue, and in that pause her expression traveled through fear, doubt, and something like recognition, before tears pooled against her will. The meat was tender, seasoned, soaked in juices that reminded the body what nourishment feels like, a sensation more powerful than ideas. She chewed slowly, as if swallowing might break whatever spell had been cast. One surrender opened the gate. Metal touched enamel. Bites followed. The first soft sounds of eating broke the silence that war had trained into them. A few bowed their heads as if in prayer. Tears traced lines through the grime of exhaustion, catching at the corners of mouths not used to softness. Butter, after years of bitter substitutes, was more than flavor. It was proof that the world contained something other than deprivation. The enemy was not poisoning them. The enemy was feeding them. A soldier nearby noticed the tears and muttered, "It's only turkey," then looked away, uneasy because he knew it was not only turkey at all. Another made a dry joke about the bird being overcooked, and to his surprise a ripple of laughter rose from the tables, thin but real, the sound startling even to those who created it. Outside,
the town still lay in rubble. Families dug for coal, children scavenged, and the coming winter sharpened its teeth. Inside this candlelit room, abundance stood like a small island in a black sea, bright enough to hurt the eyes. A young woman gripped her plate with both hands as if it were the only solid thing left, tears falling into gravy she tried not to waste. Yet conflict did not lift with the scent of sage and onions. Shame crouched behind
make of everything that had filled the graves. Officers watching from a distance expected relief, perhaps gratitude, not the shock of tears. A soldier leaned to another and said they had given them thanksgiving, then asked what would happen if the prisoners began to believe it. The question hung heavier than smoke in the air and refused to disperse. The quiet did not last. Hunger had been answered, but minds trained by fear began to move again, testing the edges of what had just happened. For years, the teaching had been simple and brutal. Americans were beasts. To fall into their hands invited abuse. Posters showed towering brutes grinning over blades. Loud voices repeated the lesson until it entered bone. One woman remembered a teacher who swore American soldiers carved marks into children's foreheads. The memory shook against the sight of young men carrying trays and spoons instead of knives. Each bite argued with propaganda, and the argument was devastatingly persuasive because it was carried not by speeches, but by warmth in the mouth and weight in the stomach. The irony did not miss the Americans. Many had fought through France and Belgium into Germany, burying friends along the way, some still carrying metal under their skin. To feed the enemy felt like an insult to the dead. One private muttered that a buddy had fallen in a forest, and now the people who once cheered were eating their holiday turkey. But even he had seen the tears and the faces softening, as if the women were remembering they were still human, and did not know what to do with that memory. The invitation itself was not only sentiment. Policy guided it, quiet but deliberate. Mercy as signal. Mercy as difference. Mercy as a line drawn away from harsher hands in the East. Food was power on a starving continent. Generosity could sow what bullets could not. What looked like hospitality doubled as strategy, and its effects ran deeper than planners imagined, because the heart is less predictable than logistics. A woman thin as a reed held her fork in shaking fingers. Her husband had vanished into the maw of the Eastern Front, her child into a night of sirens and fire over a northern city. She expected humiliation in custody, punishment for loyalty once demanded of everyone. Instead, warmth burned her fingertips when she took a piece of bread, and the shock barracks in careful voices. Some spoke of the crisp skin, the creamy mash, the impossible softness of bread after years of hardness, as if describing something sacred. Others spoke of tears, embarrassed and unhidden. They would not name it kindness, not yet, but they could not deny that what they were told to expect had failed to arrive. History is written in battles and signatures, but here the battlefield was the space between what the mouth knew and the mind insisted upon. The contradiction cut deep. Cities shattered, and families scattered by the same flag now offering a second helping. It was not forgiveness, but it was confusion. And confusion is often the first step toward change. Numbers tell their own story. In late 1945, the average daily intake for many civilians fell to levels that barely sustained life. In bombed districts, it dipped lower still, and malnutrition spread quickly, dropping children in schools and women in ruins. Against that backdrop, a holiday plate was not simply generous. It was a miracle, measured in warmth returning to faces. For many, it was the first time in years they ate until fullness became a sensation rather than a memory. Satiety carried a moral weight words struggled to hold, because the body keeps its own ledgers. The soldiers had not meant to make anyone cry. They wanted a taste of home, a reminder of kitchens and clean tables. But the consequence reached further than any banner could reach. The women saw humanity where they expected fangs, and once seen, the image would not blur again. Reconciliation was not guaranteed by a single dinner. Tears over turkey do not level graveyards or rebuild streets. The conflict remained, lodged like a splinter. How to live in a world where the enemy could act with decency without betraying the dead. A soldier leaned in a doorway as the women shuffled back to bunks, and later wrote that the war cracked a little at the table that night. The thought puzzled him for years, because the crack was quiet and yet somehow decisive. Snow began to sift down over the ruined town, softening edges carved by fire. Inside the wire, shame. 2 blades crossed in the same chest. A young prisoner of 23 felt the collapse of certainty like a fall through ice. She had shouted slogans as a teenager and clung to them while bombs fell. And now she sat at a rough table, chewing a rectangle of sweetness handed over by a man whose name she would never learn. Tears surprised her. Relief mingled with shame for believing lies because lies had once felt like safety. She whispered into the dark, "If the enemy is human, what does that make of us?" Guards were told not to fraternize. Orders frayed in the face of hunger and memory. A farm boy from the plains looked at the women and saw his sisters if the war had come to his fields instead of theirs. That thought gnawed at him harder than any rule. In the mess hall, laughter returned in small, startled bursts, the ordinary reappearing like a bird brave enough to land on a ruined sill. Policy kept working in the background like a quiet engine. Shipments of grain and milk powder, meat that kept famine from becoming a second war, and an understanding from high offices that starving millions breed fury, not peace. The plan with a great name would come later. Its seeds were already sprouting in the plainest possible medium: food. You cannot eat propaganda, and you cannot chew a lie. The mouth knows which is which. One evening, a woman of 35, once fervent with torchlight and slogans, held a soft crust and broke into sobs, words failing at the threshold of truth she no longer knew how to frame. Frost melts quietly. Walls fall with a sound smaller than expected. The irreversible rarely announces itself. Humor slipped in on careful feet. A soldier claimed the bird died twice, once in the field, once in the oven, and the women laughed, not because the line was sharp, but because absurdity felt safer than sorrow. Not everyone welcomed the softening. Some men muttered that compassion was weakness. Some women ate without raising their eyes, determined not to trade dignity for relief. But cracks, once opened, spread. Even those resisting felt hunger speak louder than pride, and mercy answer in a language older than flags. By the 3rd week after Thanksgiving, women no longer flinched when bread arrived. Part of breathing. If the story had been false about this, what else had been constructed from smoke? At night, that question moved in the dark like an unquiet thing, and sleep came late. A corporal scrawled in a small notebook that they cried when they ate, and he thought the war ended a little at that table, for them and for him. Battles end on paper. Wars end in hearts, often over supper rather than speeches. Snow deepened. Lines at relief stations lengthened. Inside the wire, meals kept despair from hollowing the body all the way through. The shock of Thanksgiving softened into routine by December. The trays arrived and were accepted without freezing in suspicion, but each bite still carried the weight of dependence on hands once painted as inhuman. It was not gratitude at first. It was an ache shaped like a paradox. Among the soldiers, tempers mixed like oil and water. Some resented the work, convinced the tears were undeserved. Others felt unsettled by grief blending with relief in faces they could not dismiss as faceless anymore. A lieutenant wrote home that fighting shadows in a field had been easier than watching people cry into their food across a table. Distance collapsed, and with it the useful simplicity of hate. Even so, small generosities multiplied. A tin of coffee, a pair of socks, a clumsy English phrase taught and repeated with shy laughter that sounded like a language rediscovering its own voice. Reconciliation did not arrive on a tray. It demanded a breaking in places pride had protected. One woman who had once shouted loudest now cupped a warm drink as if it were a rope thrown into cold water, and tasted, along with cocoa, the bitterness of having been used by lies she had served. Officers understood symbolism as well as logistics. A fed prisoner can one day become an ally. A starving one remains an enemy in waiting. Leaders spoke of mercy as strength, generosity as proof, and so dinners became lessons without a chalkboard. Statistics would later say that millions lived because shipments crossed the ocean. But numbers cannot measure a hand turning an apple as if it were a jewel, or the way laughter softens a room accustomed to weeping. Some resisted the stitching back together of human, lifted their eyes, unsure and sincere, and the gesture traveled farther than any speech. Reconciliation carried shadows with it. Relief did not erase graves. Kindness did not rebuild what fire took. Memory and mercy learned to share space without touching. Later, some would say the war ended for them the night turkey made them cry, because truth sometimes arrives disguised as gravy and bread rolls, asking for nothing in return. The question remained at the edge of every shared meal. If mercy can be found in an enemy, what does that make of all the hate, the blood, the sacrifices laid like stones behind them? The burden rested on both sides and would not be set down quickly. The silence after the holiday did not harden again. It thinned, like ice under a shy sun, fragile and uncertain, but changed all the same. Within the wire, routine returned, roll call, work details, lights out. But something soft now threaded through these hours, a sense that the world beyond slogans might be wider than fear had allowed. The women carried the taste of turkey as if it were an ember wrapped in cloth, not enough to warm the whole body, yet too bright to ignore. Grief lingered like smoke. Even so, speech began to replace silence. Whispers grew into sentences exchanged across rough tables, a cautious rebuilding of voices long forced underground. The change did not arrive with horns or banners. It came in small acts that would have seemed ordinary in peace, and thus felt extraordinary now. A cigarette passed from a soldier's palm to a tremoring hand. A square of chocolate dropped with a theatrical shrug, as though it had simply fallen from a pocket by mistake. Sweetness, divided into tiny shares, moved from bunk to bunk with the reverence reserved for blessings. And for a moment, the barracks resembled a parish more than a prison. Each gesture tapped a loose brick in the wall, and though the wall still stood, the light between stones widened. Outside, the ruined town braced for the worst of winter. Inside, small mercies kept despair from eating through the last layer of resolve. Reports from that season spoke in cold terms: calories, shortages, queues that stretched along streets until they turning a shared piece of chocolate in her fingers as if it might disappear between blinks. She had cheered speeches as a girl and repeated slogans because they kept terror at bay. Now, a nameless soldier's kindness undid those words without raising his voice. Tears surprised her, not only for relief, but for the shame of having swallowed lies whole, because hunger for certainty is its own famine. She whispered into a blanket that if the enemy is human, then what had they been taught to become? No order ever fully prevents recognition. Sight, once altered, refuses to return to ignorance. For the Americans, rules forbade fraternization, but rules lose arguments with hunger and memory more often than officers admit. A farm boy from the plains saw his sisters in these tired faces, imagined what his own kitchen would look like if war had come to his county instead, and the picture stayed with him longer than training could scrub away. He said later that hate is easiest in the abstract and hardest across a table when someone cries over a cup of thin cocoa. In the mess hall, laughter returned like a cautious animal, step by step, startled by every clatter and yet unwilling to leave entirely. It was the ordinariness that shocked them both. Coffee spilled, a joke about bad cooking, a hand mopping up with a sleeve and waving it away. High above the barracks and the kitchen's steam, strategy ticked forward on schedules and cargo lists. Grain, powdered milk, meat sent where famine would otherwise settle. The grand plan that would later bear a famous name was still years away, but its logic already breathed here. Feed people, and the future grows less hostile. Mercy doubles as policy when the stakes are nations. The lesson did not need chalkboards. It moved along tin trays and into empty hands. You cannot eat a slogan. You cannot chew a speech. But bread answers an argument the body understands, without translation. One evening, a woman in her mid-30s, who had once marched beneath torchlight and shouted herself hoarse, stared at a crust that yielded under her fingers and broke into tears so sudden she had to cover her mouth to keep from sobbing. The taste carried not only warmth, but revelation. Ate without raising their eyes, jaws set, determined to take the food, but not the gesture. Even so, cracks travel, and once a wall is mapped by fissures, it stops being a wall and becomes a waiting collapse. By the third week after Thanksgiving, bread no longer arrived as a test of courage, and cups no longer carried the rumor of poison. They were simply bread and cups, and relief, and the quiet admission that fear had been fed a false story. Similarity, once invisible, insisted on being seen. Soldiers hummed off-key tunes, complained about sergeants, flashed creased photographs, whittled toys from scrap when boredom gnawed. None of these details fit the shape of a monster. They fit the shape of a neighbor from whom history had torn the fence down in the worst possible way. Each mark of ordinariness swung another blow at the mythology that had kept them apart. Peace of mind did not follow those blows. With every bite, another thread of belief snapped. And in the night the question returned. If they were lied to about this, what else had been smoke dressed as truth? Sleep faltered under the weight of answers that refused to come when called. A corporal wrote that tears fell over food, and in that moment he believed a portion of the war ended at a table rather than on a field. Paper ends battles. People end wars, quietly, while eating, by choosing not to flinch when a hand offers something warm. Snow thickened. Beyond the wire, lines at relief stations lengthened until they bent like rivers around corners. Inside, meals became a daily armistice, unspoken but binding enough to keep despair from finishing what bombs had begun. By December, shock had yielded to routine. Trays were accepted, and a strange ache set in, the ache of living because an enemy had decided not to let one starve. Among the men, emotions tangled. Some called the tears undeserved. Others found themselves thrown off balance by grief and gratitude sharing the same face.
A lieutenant wrote home that it is easier to fight people who remain silhouettes, harder when they sit across from a person crying into bread and butter. Distance collapsed, and with it the clean geometry of us and them.
The way a woman turned an apple in her hand as if it were a jewel, or how a room changed key when laughter replaced the steady note of weeping. Some refused the tune. Pride is often the last fortress after everything else is lost. Yet butter melts on bread in a language the body understands at once, and that grammar rewrites even the most stubborn sentences. Christmas Eve fell softly, muffling boots on packed snow, and a harmonica passed from mouth to mouth until a carol in English found its echo in German. The melody bridged what words could not, and voices rose together, shaky at first, then sure enough to fill a barracks meant to divide. Tears returned, not as protest or hunger, but as recognition that song can be a kind of truce. Morning brought bread and small hand-shaped pats of butter. No feast, only enough to be called enough, and that was miracle enough for one day. Some smiled, tentative and sincere, and the smile traveled like light along a line of faces that had forgotten how to receive it. Mercy did not absolve the past. Graves remained, cities remained broken, names remained spoken in rooms where the person no longer answered. The uneasy coexistence of memory and mercy became the new discipline, harder than drills and more necessary. Years later, a woman would say that the war ended for her when the taste of turkey made her cry, because truth sometimes arrives dressed in gravy and wrapped in a roll of bread. The question stayed at the rim of every bowl. If mercy can be found in the enemy, what does that make of all the hate poured like concrete between them? Both sides carried it, and neither could put it down quickly. Snow thickened over the Rhineland, softening jagged brick and blackened beams, until even ruins seemed to rest beneath a clean sheet of silence. Inside the camp, life settled into a narrow rhythm: roll call, work, the measured clatter of trays. But the old stillness no longer ruled with an iron hand. The ember from that first holiday meal did not blaze. It glowed in small ways, warming speech back into the rooms, keeping despair from finishing its work. Women who had once swallowed their words now tested them aloud, shy at first, then fraternization, but orders rarely outtalk the evidence of the eyes. Men whose hands had learned to aim learned also to pass cups, to steady plates, to remind themselves that war had taught them many skills, not all of them worth keeping. One of them, a city boy who had never seen a wheat field, admitted that grief can harden a heart until kindness cracks it from the other side. He could not decide whether the crack was loss or relief. The women felt the crack too, and it frightened them. Pride had been the last unbroken thing they owned, and every kind gesture pressed against it like a thumb testing glass. Some decided to take only what the body demanded and refused the rest. They ate and looked at no one. They drank and spoke to no one. Others, without deciding, found themselves smiling back when a joke stumbled across the table and asked for a home. The change crept in like warmth creeping into numb hands, painful at first, then an ache that proved life was still present. Stories began to circulate in low voices. The man who slipped a pair of socks across a bench without looking up. The guard who could carve a small horse from scrap wood and left it where a child might once have found it. The cook who pretended not to see a second ladle of gravy land where it was needed most. These were not policies. They were human reflexes, revived by proximity and repetition. Small mercies accumulate. They stack quietly until their weight shifts what people think is possible. By then, the old warnings sounded like a language spoken through a wall, their syllables intact, but their meaning strangely thinned. On a bitter morning, a woman who once corrected others on slogans, stood in the yard and watched flakes circle down. She thought of torchlight and banners, of voices built to fill squares and drown out doubt. When she tried to summon that certainty, what answered back was not a chorus, but the memory of butter melting on bread. She broke then, not with noise, but with a sigh that softened her shoulders, and she let herself be ordinary for the length of a breath. The act felt like treason and rescue at once. Men in offices far away measured that winter in shipments and tonnage. Grain, powdered milk, tinned meat, moving along. A storm had finally used up its rain. Christmas passed, quieter than any before it and kinder than any since the war began. There was no abundance, only enough, and enough can feel like a miracle to those who have forgotten the word. A few smiles lasted longer than politeness requires. A few thanks were spoken in accents that made both sides listen closely. No one pretended graves had vanished, or that ruined streets had risen overnight. The miracle was smaller and therefore truer. People who had been told to fear one another learned to share air without tightening. With the year turning, thaw arrived like a rumor. Mud replaced the safety of ice, and with it came the messier work of walking forward without a map. The women felt less defined by fences and more by the stubborn thread of survival they now shared with the men who guarded them. It was not friendship nor forgiveness, only the beginning of an admission that enemies are people the day before and people the day after. A war names them otherwise. Between those days, food had done what slogans could not. Still, a question pressed from beneath every meal. If kindness could survive inside uniforms, what else might have been true behind the noise of marching and the glare of parades? The question frightened the Americans, too, because it tugged on ropes tied to their own certainties. A private confessed in a letter that he no longer knew what to do with his hate. It had been fuel, and now it felt like ash. He was not proud of the relief. He worried what came next, when engines run out and the road keeps going. Spring did not arrive cleanly. It seeped through the seams. The camp smelled less of coal smoke and more of damp wood. Along the fence, a green line traced where seeds, carried by wind and chance, decided conditions were sufficient. Someone pointed and laughed, quiet, delighted, the sound of a person recognizing life in a place designed to keep life contained. That laugh traveled farther than barbed wire, because sound always does. In time, records would gather statements. An officer noting improved morale, a requisition for additional coffee, a tally of blankets issued after a sudden frost. None of those lines could hold the shape of a moment when two strangers recognized themselves in each other's ordinary gestures. A hand learning turned out required labor. It asked them to work at being human in a place built to make that difficult. The Americans labored too, if less visibly. They learned to sit with contradictions, to mourn friends while easing someone else's hunger, to follow orders while making room for discretion, to admit that war had taught them how to destroy and now ask them to practice repair. Repair is slower. It lacks spectacle. It makes no posters worth waving. It persists anyway, a habit learned by doing. By the time true thaw set in, both sides had changed enough to notice. The women no longer braced at every approach. The men no longer mistook distance for discipline. What remained were the unavoidable facts, the missing, the ruined, the ledger of harm, and alongside them something unplanned, a record of shared meals and borrowed songs, of small jokes and smaller gifts, of the curious relief of discovering that the world had not run out of ordinary. That discovery did not end the war's work, but it made the next work possible.